This video is sponsored by Ground News. I used to think that entropy is a measure of disorder. If you look at my room, for example, this is pretty ordered, so it's very low entropy, but give it a few hours and it'll become highly disordered, very high entropy. So look, the entropy of the universe naturally tends to increase. The second law of thermodynamics. It all makes perfect sense. Or does it? If you pour milk into coffee, then there is a point in time where the milk and the coffee are just mixing together, right? But then after a few more minutes, if you give it some time, then eventually it'll all be nice and mixed. So look over here. Did the universe just go from highly disordered to being ordered? Meaning, did the entropy of the universe decrease? No. This is actually low entropy state, and this is actually high entropy state. But how does that make any sense? And when you think from the point of view of order and disorder, it was all confusing for me. And that's why entropy and second law of thermodynamics actually did not make a lot of sense until I started reading Feynman lectures. Oh my God, then my mind was blown. So the goal of this video is not just to rediscover the ideas of entropy or the second law of thermodynamics. No. It's also to gain a deep intuition behind why it's called the era of time, or how it makes its way into information theory, or how does it even allow life to exist in the first place. So if you're ready for this, let's begin. So Feynman, where do we start? Feynman says, Mahesh, since we're on a journey of rediscovery, forget whatever you know about entropy or second law of thermodynamics, which is easy for me, and look at these two videos. One of them is a video that's being played in forwards, and another one is just the reverse of it. Which one is the reverse? And I'm like, that's pretty easy. The second one, because coffee and milk spontaneously does not unmix itself. So that's the reversed one. But Feynman asks why? I mean, look at it at the microscopic level. If you could see individual atoms or molecules in motion, then in one of the cases, you might see a motion that looks like this. It's completely colliding and it's moving in a very random manner. Now, if you look at the reverse of it, it looks like this. And Feynman asks, Mahesh, now can you tell which is going forward in time and which is going backwards in time? And I'm like, no, now you can't tell. Both of them look like they're going forward in time. There's no distinction between them. So this means at the microscopic level, you cannot tell whether atoms motion or molecular motion is going forwards or backwards in time. And yet, if you look at the collection of these very same atoms at a macroscopic level, you can tell whether you're looking at something that's going forwards or backwards in time. In other words, atoms or molecular motion is completely reversible. The laws of physics, whether you consider classical mechanics or quantum mechanics, whatever, does not care about going forwards or backwards in time, does not distinguish between them. So it's completely reversible. And yet, at the macroscopic level, the collection of these very same atoms and molecules, their processes are purely irreversible. How? How do you get these irreversible processes from completely reversible events? That is a key question. And I'm like, wow. People say that learning is about asking the right question. And this is a profound question. How do you get irreversibility from completely reversible microscopic events? What's going on over here, Feynman? Well, since the motion of every single particle, like atoms or molecules, is completely reversible, the answer does not lie in physics. But because when you consider the collection of large number of atoms or molecules, that's where the irreversibility comes, which means the answer actually should lie in statistics. Wow. But Feynman, statistics, I'm pretty bad at it. And Feynman says, don't worry, we'll do it step by step. In fact, we'll start with a warm-up example. Consider you have 10 marbles with you and you have a box, and you're going to close your eyes and you're going to throw these marbles randomly into the box. After throwing all of 10 of them, you'll get some pattern, right? I'm going to show you two patterns and you have to tell me which one's more likely. So here's the first one. You might get a pattern that looks like this after throwing them into the box. And the second pattern you might get, it looks like this. Mahesh, which of these two patterns look more likely to you once you've thrown them randomly? In fact, if you can answer this correctly, then that's it. You'll be able to rediscover everything else all by yourself. So those stakes are pretty high. I'm like, that's easy. The second one. And Feynman's like, why? I'm like, well, that's because what's the chances of it getting all the marbles lining up right next to each other? That should be very low. The second one, therefore, is much more likely. And Feynman says, all right, let's compute this. And I'm like, wait a second, how do we do the math? That looks complicated. No, we'll simplify. In fact, what we can do over here is we can assume that there are 5 rows and there are 8 columns, which means there are a total of 40 slots. Now, come over here and think of it this way. Okay, Mahesh, what is the probability of the first marble which you throw lands exactly over here? How do you compute that? Well, think about it. There are 40 slots, and the chance of landing in any one of these slots is exactly the same. So the probability of landing in this particular slot is 1 out of 40, right? Okay, now what is the chance of the second marble landing over here? Well, again, now there are 39 slots available. I mean, we can assume that if it lands on top of this marble, we'll repeat the experiment, okay? So there are 39 marble slots available, and each one is equally likely. So now the chances of landing over here is 1 over 39. Similarly, the chance of landing over here is 1 over 38, and so on and so forth. And of course, we need to do a little bit more work to actually compute the probability, but that's not important. What matters is this is how we would go about it, right? If you do the first one, now let's try to do the second one and see what we get. Again, Mahesh, what is the chance of the first marble landing over here exactly? It's 1 over 40. What about the second marble landing over here? 1 over 39, and so on and so forth. This means the probability that you would get for this specific pattern is exactly the same as you would get for this pattern. They're both equally likely or both equally unlikely. Wait a second, why that does not make any intuitive sense. What's going on over here? Well, think of it this way. Here you said, what are the chances that all the marbles will land right next to each other? So this must be highly unlikely, right? But the same is the case over here. What are the chances that, one marble lands exactly 1 square to the right, another marble lands exactly 2 squares to the left, and so on and so forth? If you think of it that way, even this pattern is very, very unlikely, isn't it? Yeah, that makes sense. So that means any pattern must have the same probability. Yes, any pattern you take must have exactly the same probability. It's just that the pattern on the top looks much more ordered to us, and therefore we think that it's much more rare. But as the math shows us, it's not any more rare than any other pattern that you take, which is incredible if you think about it. But Feynman, why did my brain make that mistake? Because I did not pause and try to verify my conclusion. As a result, I had an error in my judgment. And this is a simple example, Mahesh, but consider what would happen if you were reading an article like this. Astronaut rushed to the hospital after returning to Earth with a mystery medical condition. You might conclude that there must be some mystery space disease going on over here. And you might have even more questions like, which astronaut over here? Is this even real or fake? But by going to ground news, I can see that this article is actually covered by 87 different sources, which gives me more confidence in it. And if I read other headlines, I will immediately see that, oh, this is about Sunita Williams. And she was in space for over 8 months. And the main problem over here was extended stay in space. In a few seconds, we got way more confidence and context in this news. And that's why I love Ground News, who are sponsoring this video. One of my favorite features over here is how I can immediately see the factuality rating. Here you can see that 75% of the sources are rated high, and I can just filter the high factuality ones like physics.org and then just go over and read that news article in detail. Ground News also has a blind spot feature, which highlights stories that are heavily covered by one side of the political spectrum, but underreported on the other. This way you can see what you might be missing and get a fuller view of the news. It's a simple way to spot gaps in coverage and make sure you're getting a balanced perspective. And I think Ground News is so cool because it was founded by a former NASA engineer to make news easier to understand without telling you what to think. With bias ratings, coverage from different perspectives, and factuality scores, it helps you see the full picture and you can make up your own mind. So if you go to ground.news/floathead or just scan this QR code, you'll get a 50% off on their Vantage subscription. And remember, when you're supporting my sponsor, you're also supporting my channel. So now back to rediscovering entropy. Now let's see if we can answer our original question using a simple example. Let's consider a gas which is trapped in one corner of a small box, and then we'll let go of it, and we know naturally that the gas tends to expand. Again, this is irreversible. Yet at the microscopic level, we know that all the molecules are, their motion is completely irreversible. So why does this happen? Well, let's see if we can answer this question. First of all, we can identify 3 distinct stages of this particular gas. Let's say it goes from being in one corner to it occupying the half of the box and then occupying the complete box over there. Our big question is, why doesn't it go backwards? Let's try to answer this question by looking at things microscopically. So over here, in this particular case, we can model this by saying, hey, it's kind of like that marble where we have 40 slots, but we are restricting those 10 marbles to only 10 slots because we're asking them to be in one particular corner. How many ways can you arrange that? Well, if you have 10 marbles and you have to restrict them to just 10 slots, there's only one way to arrange that, like this. So there's only one arrangement available to get this particular state. But now for this particular state, it's kind of like modeling it and saying that, hey, now those 10 marbles can occupy, half the box, which means about 20 slots. They can occupy 20 slots. How many ways can you arrange them? Well, now there are a lot of ways you can arrange them because there'll be a lot of empty spaces, right? In fact, if you do the math, it turns out the total number of arrangements would be a staggering about 0.18 million. That many arrangements will now be available for this particular state. And finally, for the fully exponent gas, we can model it by saying that, hey, now these 10 marbles can occupy all the 40 slots of our box. And now, because there are more empty spaces, there are even more arrangements available over here. In fact, if you add them up, it turns out you'll get 850 million arrangements. Again, the numbers are not important. How we got that is not important, but you can kind of intuitively make sense, right? More empty space means more number of ways you can arrange them. So the number should be very high. So look, the total number of arrangements we have is 850 plus 0.18 plus 1, which is about 850 million arrangements. All right. So now let's imagine that our gas is in this state. Our question is, what's going to happen in the future? Well, it can go backwards, right? Because at the microscopic level, everything is reversible. So it can go backwards. But what is the probability? Let's figure that out. What's the probability of it going backwards? Well, if it has to go backwards, then how many arrangements do we have that goes backwards? Well, there's only one arrangement belonging to this particular thing out of 850 million arrangements. So if all of these arrangements are equally likely, the chances of this arrangement spontaneously occurring from here is 1 over 850 million. And the chance of that is almost zero. That's why the chances of a gas going back is almost zero. Similarly, what is the chance that the gas can stay in that same arrangement? Because they have so many arrangements, it's possible the gas can stay in that same state. Well, again, there are 0.18 million arrangements available for this particular state. So the chances of, picking any one of these is 0.18 million out of the total 850 million, which is again, almost zero. So the chances of gas staying in that state is also pretty much zero. Now, what is the chances that the gas goes to this state? Well, for that, we ask how many arrangements are available. There are 850. Almost all the arrangements over here belongs to this state. So the probability of getting that is almost 100%. So look, right in front of your eyes, we have the answer to our original question. Why is it that even though at the microscopic level things are reversible, every single arrangement is equally likely, so things are reversible, what happens at a macroscopic level? At the macroscopic level, the number of arrangements belonging to this one is so much low that it cannot go backwards. So for all practical purposes, the chances of going backwards is zero. And the number of arrangements available for this one is so much high, the chances of it going forward is much more, it's almost 100%. And that's why at the macroscopic level, it goes in one direction. Things tend to be irreversible. Does that make sense? So now we can define what entropy is. Let's first introduce some jargons. What we see at the macroscopic level, we call them macrostates. So macrostate is basically what you see at the macroscopic level. There are 3 distinct macrostates over here. Okay. Now for each macrostate, the number of different arrangements that you have is what we call the microstates, because at the microscopic level. All right. Now what is entropy? Entropy is a measure of the number of microstates. That's what we define entropy as. And now we can understand why this is low entropy, because it has only one microstate and therefore very low entropy. But this one has a lot of microstates, so there is very high entropy. And so if you take any system, the chances of the entropy decreasing is negligibly low. And that's why we can now intuitively come up with second law of thermodynamics, which we can say that the entropy of an isolated system will never decrease. Beautiful, isn't it? But fine then, wait a second. Shouldn't we say that the entropy of a closed system, and we'll come back to closed system a little bit later as to why it is called a closed system. Anyways, shouldn't we say that it will most likely not decrease, because it's all about probability. There's a good chance. There's a very tiny chance it can decrease. Well, Feynman says, yeah, technically, Mahesh, you're right. But look at the numbers. Even with just 10 marbles and 40 slots, look, the chances of it going back is so low. Now, imagine what would happen in the realistic case where we have 10 to the 27 atoms and we're dealing with so many more empty spaces and so many more slots. The chances of it going back would be astronomically low. So yes, technically, there is a small chance that a gas in a room will spontaneously go into a corner. but the probability of that is ridiculously small. It's so small that you'll have to wait more than the age of the universe, something like that, right? And so what's fascinating to me is that this whole irreversibility is just probabilistic. It's not laws of physics, but it's the laws of statistics. It's math that makes things irreversible. That is awesome. Anyways, we can now also understand the whole idea behind order and disorder. When we say something is ordered, we basically mean a macrostate in which there are less number of microstates, less number of way to arrange that. And we say something is disordered, what we really mean is a macrostate in which there are more number of microstates, more number of ways to arrange that. That's what we mean. But now that we have a much more concrete definition of macrostates and microstates, let's not use the word order and disorder anymore. Now, let's go back to our coffee and the milk example. Why does it go from this state, completely being, separated, to mixing together? Why doesn't it go backwards? Well, again, if we can model it, we can say that this one, it's kind of like having a microstate like this. There's only one arrangement for that, and therefore this has the lowest entropy, lowest number of microstates. Over here, it's kind of like saying that, hey, you know what? You can mix over here. In this particular section, probably coffee and milk particles can mix. So now we start getting more number of arrangements available. And so the number of microstates increases, and therefore the entropy is higher. Okay, but in this particular case, it's kind of like saying, hey, you know what? The coffee particles and milk particles can occupy whatever states it, whatever slots it wants. And now you will have the highest number of arrangements for this. And therefore, this is the highest entropy. And so now you can see, why is this low entropy? Because there are less number of microstates. This is high entropy because there are more number of microstates. And naturally, you tend to go from a macrostate of low entropy to a macrostate of high entropy. It's probability. Beautiful, isn't it? And this now explains why entropy decides the arrow of the time. If you look at things at a microscopic level, you can't tell whether you're looking at an evolution that's going forward in time or you're going backwards in time, because all microstates are equally likely. So there is no arrow of time at the microscopic level. But it's only when you look at its corresponding macrostates, the picture becomes much more clear. It is evident that as we go forward in time, we can only go towards macrostate that has high entropy, because that's a high probability chance. And that's the reason why at a macroscopic level, things are irreversible, giving us a particular arrow of time from the past to the future. So what's profound and blows my mind away is that the arrow of time does not come from physics. It actually comes from statistics and probability. That is insane, if you ask me. Understanding why entropy of an isolated system can never decrease makes perfect sense when you think in terms of microstates. Or does it? Feynman, I think I can break the second law of thermodynamics very easily. Just go back to that particular gas, and I'm just going to introduce a piston over here, and I'm just going to flick that piston, and then look, the gas gets compressed. Doesn't that mean that the entropy of the gas is reduced? I've broken the second law of thermodynamics. Now, in my heart, I know this does not break the second law of thermodynamics, but this is the most powerful way to learn. When you learn something new, try to critique it, try to break it, and see what the logical flaw is. That's how you deepen your understanding and gain mastery. Your teachers may not like it, but that is the best way to learn. So over here, I now know that entropy is a number of microstates. Compressing the gas reduces the number of microstates. So shouldn't the entropy reduce? Answer in terms of the number of microstates, Feynman. And Feynman says, yes, Mahesh, as you compress the gas, the number of ways you can arrange the particles will reduce. So you might think that it reduces the number of microstates, but so far we ignored something. See, when you compress a gas this way, it heats it up, meaning it increases its temperature. Temperature is a measure of the average kinetic energy, which means now there is more kinetic energy for these particles. If you give it more kinetic energy, you can distribute that kinetic energy in various ways, and each of them now adds to its microstates. So although in this model there is only one way to arrange that particles, but there are so many ways to arrange that kinetic energy, distribute that kinetic energy, that you end up with lots and lots of microstates. So you have a lot of microstates because even kinetic energy can be distributed for a given particle arrangement. So when you compress a gas this way, the number of microstates does not decrease. In fact, it actually increases. And I'm like, this makes so much more sense now. This is the reason why if you have a gas at high temperature, it has a high entropy compared to an identical gas of low temperature. It has lower entropy. Well, earlier I should think that high temperature means more randomness, but now we can think more concretely. High temperature means more kinetic energy available, so there are more ways in which you can distribute it, adding to the number of microstates, increasing the entropy. Beautiful, isn't it? But wait, we're not going to give up. There's another way to try and break the second law of thermodynamics. What if we could compress this gas without increasing its temperature? One way to do that is by introducing Maxwell's demon. James Maxwell came up with an interesting thought experiment. He asked, what if there was a hyper-intelligent being or some kind of an advanced computer system, whatever it is, we're going to call that Maxwell's demon. If she could learn the positions and the velocities of every single particle, then she can have a trapdoor over here and she can make sure that whenever there is a high energy particle coming from the right to the left, she allows that particle to go through. But if there's a high energy particle coming from the left to the right, she will not allow it to go through. This way, she can ensure that all the high energy particles from the right will eventually end up towards the left. In other words, she would have compressed the gas without changing its kinetic energy. There you have it. We have reduced the entropy of the system. What you gotta say about that, Feynman? And Feynman says, Mahesh, first of all, calm down, okay? Second of all, you are right. The entropy of the gas might have reduced, but what about the entropy of the Maxwell's demon's brain? Let's consider the state of her brain before and after she learns about the velocities and the positions and all of that, okay? Now, before learning about the positions and the velocities, she has no information. And we can model that by saying that all the bits of that particular part of her brain is 0, right? So no information means all zeros. And how many ways can you arrange all zeros in a particular section of the brain? There's only one way, all zeros. There's only one arrangement you have, which means this represents low entropy because there's only one microstate. Now, once she learns about the positions and all of that, that specific part of the brain will now have some information. And how do we model some information? Well, she will have some zeros and some ones. How can you now arrange some zeros and some ones? There are so many ways to arrange it. You can arrange it this way and this way and this way. So there are so many arrangements available. That means the number of microstates explodes, which means this now represents high entropy. So just by learning, she hasn't done anything else, just by learning about the positions, just by acquiring information, the entropy of her brain has exploded. This makes sense, right? So earlier, the gas had high entropy and her brain had low entropy. Now, once she finishes all her tricks, the gas gets compressed and ends up having low entropy, but her brain ends up having high entropy. If you consider the total entropy of the system, it would not have reduced. At max, it would stay the same, but it would not reduce. And for me, what's blowing my mind at this point is look at how far we have come just by the idea of microstates. We can now understand that when something acquires information, its entropy must increase. The number of microstates increases, the entropy increases. Acquiring information increases the entropy of that object. This is how entropy makes its way into information theory. This is beautiful, isn't it? But wait, I have another silly idea to break the second law of thermodynamics. I'm not going to stop. What if I just take a hot gas and just keep it in touch with a cold gas? Then we know heat will start flowing from the hot gas to cold gas until the temperature equalizes. And in doing so, look, the temperature of the hot gas has reduced, meaning the entropy must have reduced. The number of, the kinetic energy has reduced, number of arrangements has reduced. So look, I have reduced the entropy of the gas. And Feynman says, yes, but remember, the second law of thermodynamics says the entropy of an isolated system cannot decrease. An isolated system is where you cannot exchange matter or energy. This first box is not an isolated system. It is exchanging matter or exchanging energy with something else. So now we need to look at the whole thing together and compare its entropy and see what happens. If you think in terms of particle arrangements, well, it will be the same because same number of particles and the same volume and everything else is the same. So we need to think in terms of the kinetic energy arrangements over here. Well, in the first case, because all the high kinetic energy is restricted to the left and all the low kinetic energies is restricted to the right, I can arrange in multiple ways, but that restriction means there are less number of ways I can arrange, I can have this arrangement. On the other hand, over here, there is no restriction. I can take the total energy and distribute it, arrange it however I want. So you can see, obviously, there will be way more arrangements available over here. This is very similar to how if you restrict coffee and milk on one side, then there is less number of arrangements. But if you allow them to mix, there will be more number of arrangements. The difference is instead of particles mixing, it is the energy that is mixing. So clearly, this is at low entropy and this is at high entropy. And so indeed, when you go from here to here, look, the entropy is increasing. But look, we now have a new perspective on entropy. We thought of entropy in terms of microstates, entropy in terms of information, but now we can think in terms of entropy as how concentrated the energy is. Low entropy means the energy is very concentrated. High entropy means the energy is more spread out. So and the universe's entropy tends to increase because energy tends to spread out more because there are more number of microstates that way. This is the reason why heat tends to flow from a high temperature region to a low temperature region, because that way the energy gets more spread out, the number of microstates increases. We now have an intuition behind the most fundamental law as to why heat flows from high temperature to low temperature. It's all about the number of microstates and probability. Amazing, isn't it? But I have one final question, one final counter. What about refrigerators? If you have a refrigerator in a room and it's not yet turned on, then it is like this, where the entropy is very high, the temperature everywhere is the same. But the moment I turn on the refrigerator, it pumps the heat out and we go to this state. And look, Feynman, we just saw that this, not just the refrigerator, but the refrigerator and the room, the entire system is at low entropy. So hasn't the entire system gone to lower entropy? Hasn't it broken the second law of thermodynamics? What are you going to say about that? And Feynman says, Mahesh, remember, this now is not an isolated system because refrigerators require a power supply. So you need to also consider the power supply as a part of your isolated system. So let's do that. So if you consider the power supply, like say a battery, then a battery has a lot of concentrated energy. Ooh, juicy, low entropy energy. So if you look at this entire system now, there is a very low entropy energy over here. So the overall entropy is pretty low. Then when you turn on the refrigerator, it uses this low entropy energy to pump out the heat. And in doing so, look at what has happened. The entropy of the room and the entropy of the source has gone up. And so if you compare it to what it was before, look, the entropy of the refrigerator's inside is lower than before, but the entropy of the room and the power source is much higher than before because the energy is much more distributed than before, which means the overall entropy ends up increasing. Refrigerators, I used to think that they try to fight the increase in entropy. They try to fight the second law of thermodynamics, but you can see they don't fight it. They too help in increasing the entropy. They reduce their local entropy, but increase the global entropy. They too are riding the wave of the second law of thermodynamics. But what's more interesting is that in order for a refrigerator to work, in order to be able to lower your local entropy, you need a low entropy energy source. If you have a low entropy energy source, you can do this, increase the number of microstates, and the second law of thermodynamics will love you. And that's exactly what life does. For example, if you take plants and plants and trees and everything, they take the low entropy energy from the sun, and they use that to reduce their local entropy so that they can stay alive and they can stay ordered, if you may. And in doing so, they increase the global entropy, increasing the number of microstates, increasing the the entropy of the whole universe. So life does not fight the second law of thermodynamics. Life also rides the wave of second law of thermodynamics. It's used up in increasing. It also increases the global entropy. So as far as second law of thermodynamics is concerned, life is an entropy increasing machine. And in doing so, now it creates fruits and vegetables. And animals will use the low entropy energy in the fruits and vegetables to keep their local entropy, small, to reduce their local entropy, and again, increasing the global entropy. Life is an entropy increasing machine. And this also helps me understand a confusion that I always had before. So I used to always think that, hey, what does it mean when we say that don't waste energy or don't consume too much energy? Because energy can neither be created nor destroyed, right? Well, now you can see what we're talking about. When we say that don't waste energy, what we really mean is don't waste low entropy energy, okay? Low entropy energy is the one that can be, that is useful to us. High entropy energy is useless to us. So when we talk in our daily terms, we are consuming energy. What we're really doing is we are consuming low entropy energy and making the entropy, the entropy of the energy higher. That's what we're continuously doing, and we're increasing the entropy of the universe. This also means we can now now counter people who say that, hey, there's energy all around us. Channel that energy inside. No, you can't channel that energy inside because that's a high entropy energy. That's not useful. If you want to channel anything, channel low entropy energy from the fruits or food into your body, not the high entropy energy that you have outside. But anyways, since life is an entropy increasing machine, this means a planet with life is much more probabilistic than a planet without life. That is amazing, right? I would have never thought of it that way, but it indeed is, because these are global entropy increasing machines. However, you do need a low entropy source, something like the sun. And that's why people believe that there must be life outside. As long as you have a habitable planet and you have the right ingredients and you have a low entropy starlight on it, for example, continuously, life is an probabilistic, eventually high probabilistic event. Eventually life must, evolve. But guess what's better than a planet with life? Planet with intelligent life, because intelligent life not only increases the global entropy using our own bodies, but we also increase global entropy using a lot of things that we do. And so intelligent life is even more probabilistic than normal life, which means if you have planets with life, there should also be planets with intelligent life given enough time. But that's a problem, because even with a small amount of time, humanity has gone from living in caves to going to different planets. Imagine what could life do, intelligent life do, if they had millions of years. They could colonize galaxies or galaxy clusters. And if they do so, we should see some signs of them. But we don't see anything when we look out. Where are they? So intelligent life does not exist, meaning life does not exist everywhere. This is the famous Fermi paradox. Maybe a topic for another video. And this is where we're going to finally stop. But we have barely scratched the surface. I mean, there was so much more about information entropy. There's about entropy with gravity, and eventually what happens to entropy of black holes, the holographic principle, so much more. If I see interest in that, I will do more research and make a separate video on that. In this video, we will explore why too many neutrons will make a nucleus extremely unstable. Another question that I had for a long time. See you.